program by, for, and about women today with Sandra Elkin.
Good evening. Tonight, more on the Northern Irish question. With me is Patricia Davidson. Patricia is press officer for the Ulster Executive Provisional Sinn Féin. Sinn Féin is a political wing of the Republican movement. Patricia is an office manager for a local doctor in Belfast. Also with me is Mary McNichol. Mary is secretary of United Brooklyn Irish. She is a member of the Northern Irish Aid. Mary works closely with the Irish National Caucus. The caucus is a coalition of 37 major Irish-American organizations. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you, Sandra.
Patricia, one of the major issues seems to be, at least in this country, is the fact that there are people who are saying, do not send any more money to Northern Ireland because it is going for guns and bombs. Would you want to comment on that?
Well, that is a totally inaccurate statement. When one takes into consideration that there are over 2,000 political prisoners being held in Ireland, England and America, the money that Northern Aid would send to Ireland is for the support of the dependents of those prisoners, and something in the region of $64,000 per week is paid to the dependents of people who are in prison. So what Northern Aid would send would only be a small drop in the ocean of that amount of money per week.
And that money is going to those families that's coming
The money
from
is going to those families. In some cases, many children are involved when their fathers are imprisoned.
Now, you mentioned political prisoners. You said Ireland, England and America.
That is correct.
What about the political prisoners here?
They are also supported in exactly the same way. Their families, I mean, they're supported in exactly the same way as they're supported in England and in Ireland.
Mary, who are those political prisoners here?
Well, one of them has just been released, Harry Hillig, and another one is going to be released on the 4th, I believe, of April. Jim Conlon from Belfast. In fact, they were ready to deport him, but there was such an outcry from all over the United States that the deportation proceedings were dropped. So he's going to be released on the 4th of April. I am not quite sure if the others' names, Sandra. There are several others.
Well, I just mentioned it because I think there are people who aren't aware that
I'm sure there are
political prisoners here.
Yes, and Jim Conlon was sentenced for conspiracy to send arms. I think you were wondering about that.
Patricia, there are essentially two peace movements in Northeast Ireland. You really don't like to say Northern Ireland.
No, the north of Ireland, or the 6 counties, is more preferable to Northern Ireland.
And one is the Republican movement, which you are a member.
That's right.
And the other is the movement started by Williams and Mairead Corrigan.
That's correct.
And I'd like to talk to you about the different philosophies of the two movements.
Well, the peace movement, as formed in August 1976, has no foundation as such. It owes its allegiance to the continued rule in Ireland of Britain, and as such has nothing to offer the people in terms of a lasting and a permanent peace. Now, the peace that we envisage in the Republican movement would be a peace with justice, but justice based on the freedom of Ireland from England. And this can only be gained by England pulling her stocks and going. If peace were gained by the peace movement, it would only be a recipe for further strife in another 10 years. There has been rebellion and war in Ireland these 800 years. So the peace movement, if they gain peace at their price, it will only be a temporary measure, whereas what we're looking for is the British to withdraw, the communities to get together, and a lasting and permanent peace based on freedom.
Essentially, the difference is that you have a policy and they do not, or program rather than a policy. Policy isn't quite correct.
On the face of it, that is exactly right. That is right.
Let's talk a little bit about your policy. For instance, are you in favour of unification?
We are in favour of unification of the whole of Ireland, turning it into the country that it once was, 32 counties. That is what we envisage, and our programme for that is called Éire Nua, which is the New Ireland. That is the dissemination of the 2 states, 6 counties and 26 counties, and putting in its place a 32 county Ireland, elected by the whole people not by two states within the one country. And that can only be gained by the British withdrawing. And in that context, there would be an election, and all the people of Ireland would elect a government that would be suited to them. Now, we have a policy within the RNU document which is federalism, and it's not unlike the American way of government, in that Ireland would be broken up into 4 states, the 4 historic provinces, Ulster, Munster, Leinster and Connaught. In this way, each region would determine its own affairs and be responsible to a central parliament, which would be based in somewhere like Athlone, which is the very centre of Ireland. And from there we would hope that the loyalist population in Ulster would take an active part in that government.
How would you, how do you provide in your federal policy for lessening some of the fears about separation of church and state? I mean, this must be in a way somewhat threatening to some of the other groups, right? So some of the Protestant groups.
That has been a fear of the loyalist down the centuries. It has been a fear engendered by British rule, in that when Britain separated Ireland, when it divided it into 2 different states, it gave over to the Protestant control over the lives of the Catholic, the nationalist population. We can understand that the Protestant, the Unionist, would have a fear of going into the south of Ireland, in that there's no dissemination of church and state. The church has considerable influence over the government, and as such the loyalists would feel very threatened in that environment. Within the Republican movement, our policy is for the separation, the total separation of church and state, by which we could guarantee absolute that the civil liberties and the rights of the Unionist, the loyalist, would be guaranteed.
You think you can affect that?
Absolutely.
What about an issue, for instance, like abortion, which I would imagine would be part of this kind of thing?
Again, that would be left entirely to the individual. Under the present system in the 26 counties, abortion is not permitted. My personal view on abortion is that it is murder, right? But that is I am expressing a personal view, being a Catholic. But again, with the separation of church and state, it would be left entirely in the hands of the individual, up to their own conscience on how they would determine that, unless it became a matter of law, you know, depending on how a government would determine its policy on it. But certainly my own personal viewpoint, not the viewpoint of the movement that I represent, is that abortion is unacceptable. It's murder.
Well, it also would be the viewpoint of most of the people in your movement, would it not?
Quite a considerable proportion. But again, they would be democratic enough to leave it to the individual, unless it became, as I say, a point of law within a new government.
I mean, as a result of maybe a national referendum or something like that?
Something of that kind.
Mary, what's the feeling of most of the Irish American organizations in this country? I mean, where do they stand? And I know you can't speak for them officially, but you certainly work with them closely and you know what their policies are.
Yes, well, I know quite a lot of Irish Americans, and we're all very closely tied in with what's happening, because most of us, this is our homeland. We'll never forget that it is, and how much our people have suffered during the years. And we feel if this struggle is not going to be ended right now, God knows when it will be ended. Our children will have to take up the fight. The following generation will have to take up the fight, as has happened throughout history. Every generation has been, since the 1798 rebellion, I believe it was, there's been an uprising approximately every 10 years or so.
Do most of the organizations in, say, the caucus support the federal policy, would you say?
We support Sinn Féin. I can only speak for myself again. I support Sinn Féin 100%.
Patricia, you must have some reading. I mean, you've been in this country and you know what kind of support you have.
Well, certainly the people that I have met, I was out here in October last year, and I've been out from the 12th of March this year, and certainly the people that I have met leaves me in no doubt as to the support that the struggle has in Ireland. It has unqualified support from any grouping that I have met, any Irish grouping that I've met here, the caucus, Northern Aid, United Brooklyn Irish. You know, the support that we have, I think the struggle will soon be over.
Would it be fair to say that the majority support you?
I would say so, yes.
Yeah.
Certainly the majority of the people that I've met support. All of them, indeed.
Mayor, you help raise money.
Yes, yes, indeed.
What happens when someone comes along and says, don't send money?
And it has made us very resentful because we know, I found it out for myself. I went home and found out myself where the money was going to. Talked with a lot of people who were almost totally supported by the money coming through Uncommon Corach, through Irish Northern Aid especially. And this is the group that I work with most often.
One of the things that's difficult, Patricia, is when Americans talk about what's happening in Northern Ireland, is there's a tremendous confusion in terms, and it's usually brought down to Protestant versus Catholic or Catholic versus Protestant, and that's really very inaccurate, isn't it?
It's inaccurate from the point of view that we might as well be Jews and Arabs or Muslims and Buddhists. The British, whenever they divided the country, they looked at the proportion of the peoples there, right? They found that in 6 counties, now Ulster, as the Loyalist recognises it, is 6 counties, but the historic province has 9 counties. Now, the British, recognising that they were going to have a power hold in the north of Ireland, took 6 counties away from the 32, and they gave over to the million Protestants who are known as Loyalists. They gave over to them complete rule over that 6 counties, and this is how they have used the 2 communities, one to suppress the other, in order for the British to maintain their own interests. So it wouldn't have mattered whether they were black or white, yellow or green. It was immaterial to the British. They used what was there, that was the inhabitants of the country, one to suppress the other, and it didn't matter. To us, it's not a sectarian war. To us, it's a war to evict the British intruder from our country.
So really, more proper terms would be nationalist and unionist.
Nationalist and unionist, nationalist and loyalist would be a more proper term.
Is part of your federal policy getting the British to withdraw from Northern Ireland immediately?
No, the 3 basic demands of the Republican movement, which have been repeated time and time again, indeed they were the subject of 2 bilateral truces with the British government, are 1, a phased orderly withdrawal of the British Army and administration. Now that could be in terms of years, depending on how long it would take for the British to extricate themselves, right? The second one would be an amnesty for all political prisoners, which would come in any event if the British withdraw. That would be automatic. And the third one, which would be thereafter, would be the self-determination of the Irish people.
Is it possible that the British will withdraw from Northern Ireland? I mean, do you have any sign that that might be going to happen?
There's absolutely no doubt that they're withdrawing at this moment. But the problem with the way that they're doing it at the present time is that they're taking out some of their soldiers, right? The troop levels have been reduced from about 15,000 to about 9,000. They are rearming the RUC and increasing the strength of the UDR. Now what we want is for the British to give us...
You probably better say...
The UDR is the Ulster Defence Regiment, which is another name for the paramilitary ultra-loyalist B Specials, right? They are being armed at this moment by the British government. Now, what we want the British to do is to give us a public declaration of their intention to leave. Now, this will create a climate whereby the loyalist will realise that he can no longer depend on the British for support, and that he will have to look to his nationalist brother to get round a table and talk it out and decide where Ireland is going without the British. But while the British drag their heels on the question of publicly declaring themselves to leave, the agony that is Ireland today will be prolonged, and the deaths will go on, because the loyalists will hold on to that last glimmer that the British are going to stay. But we see the signs that they're going.
Let's talk a little bit about the IRA. One of the things that kept running through our conversations earlier was the misinformation that we're all getting and the distortion. And one of the things, before we get into the distortion, that I'd like to talk about is the image of the IRA in this country. And it's, if you'll pardon me for saying so, it's a bad image. We hear about the IRA killing, bombing, that kind of thing. And that's mostly what we hear about.
Well, that certainly is how the propaganda machine has worded the IRA right from the beginning of time. But if there was no British in Ireland, there would be no IRA. And that is the basic, it's putting it in a very simplified form. But if there was no British in Ireland, i.e. their army and their administration, there would be no need for the IRA. The IRA are a direct result of British violence in Ireland. The British came to Ireland in violence, they have maintained the state in violence, and the IRA is a direct product of that institutionalised violence.
What about the charges that the IRA is responsible for the deaths of innocent people?
Well, although I wouldn't profess to speak on behalf of the IRA, I have done some very careful studies of deaths in the north of Ireland from 1968. And whilst it's not always nice to categorise people who are dead, my facts and figures have proven beyond all doubt that 75 to 80% of the deaths from 1969 have been caused as a direct result of British involvement, i.e. British soldiers have killed people or their loyalist paramilitary organisations have killed people. The IRA have been responsible for deaths and they would not hide that fact themselves, but they have minimised and they have tried to minimise casualties as far as possible. Indeed, many of the casualties are themselves.
Mary, you have an example of some of our misinformation.
You mean the distortion in the media when it does come across at all? Well, one example I had when I called up Associated Press to give them a night of information that came through from Sinn Féin in Belfast. They said, we cannot accept that news except it comes through London, who we know in turn get it from Lisburn, outside Belfast, which is the British Army headquarters. So that sounds kind of, you know, blatantly biased to me, taking one side only. And then another example is on how they distort the news or kill it. Peter Martin is a CBS correspondent in Belfast, and at a recent press conference here in the United States, someone asked him, why are we not getting the news of British torture from Ireland? And he said, well, I have sent several reports on it, but it has been killed in New York. So these are two blatant examples, but I could go on and on forever. We call up daily to protest the distortions and the lies. So it is very widespread. We don't know how best to go about it, to counteract it. Apparently there's an awful lot of money being poured into this country from the British Information Services. And this would be my guess.
What about the torture? Our government has now sort of gotten into the act and has been protesting on a human rights level.
Yeah, well, Mr. Carter, your president, has actually come out, and recently in Massachusetts, I think Mary has some information on that, he has come out and spoke about the torture, the deprivation of human rights in the north of Ireland, and certainly we are very glad to see that someone of his calibre has come forward. We hope that it will be sustained and that it will have some effect, although I personally do not believe that it will have any effect, because the British have been proven guilty of torture at Strasbourg and have actually publicly admitted the torture. Their Defence Secretary, Sam Silken, has said he's made a promise to be a very good boy and there'll be no more torture, but this torture is going on day and daily. 3 weeks ago, a young man who is a patient of the doctor that I work for was pushed through a window 2 stories up, and as a result the left side of his head is caved in, his eye came out. I don't know whether he's dead or not yet, I haven't heard any news from home, but this is the torture that goes on day and daily. And they have a new system of detention by which very young people are detained for 7 days.
Well, on what grounds are they picked up?
They're picked up on suspicion of being a member of an illegal organisation. That is the general term used, being a member of an illegal organisation, i.e. a member of the IRA. Mostly this act is applied to the nationalist community. Very rarely is it applied to the loyalist community. In fact, I have never heard of any cases of it being applied to the loyalist community. But it means that a child, someone say 16, 17 years of age, is taken into custody and is held there incommunicado for 7 days. and is interrogated non-stop for 7 days, and after which any child will be willing to sign his name to any confession. I have no doubt about that.
Have you ever been arrested?
I have been. I was sentenced on one occasion to suspend a sentence for having illegal documents, things like that. Purely political charges. But I certainly have no qualms about supporting the Republican movement. I support them to the hilt, and the British know that well.
Well, do you think, you say the torture is continuing now, and you have, first-hand information about that?
Well, anybody that is charged, anybody that is arrested and goes into a detention centre physically fit, like myself at this moment, I'm physically fit, and ends up being charged while in bed in hospital, something has to have gone wrong in the interim period. Would you agree?
Are you talking about Mairead Drum?
No, I'm not only talking about Mairead Drum, I'm talking about young people that are being charged in mental institutions. We had recently 2 cases of 2 young boys in Lurgan, and both were charged at a hospital bedside with an offence. Well, now they went into the detention centre physically fit, and they ended up in a mental institution. So what went on in the interim period? This is daily life in the north of Ireland. We have people in Derry being gassed before interrogation to make them more amenable to the questions being put to them.
What about Mairead Drum? I think a lot of people don't really understand what happened to her.
Well, Mairead Drum was arrested after a parade, what the RUC, that's the Royal Ulster Constabulary, it's a Gestapo-type fascist police force. They arrested her and were attempting to charge her with taking part in an illegal parade, i.e. the parade took part without them knowing about it. That's what they call it, an illegal parade. She was held under the 7-day detention act, and it totally destroyed her physically. And as a result of that, and also an eye problem that she had, she ended up in hospital, a worn-out shell. That's the only way I can describe her. I saw her the night before she was killed, and she said that she would never get over that 7 days detention. So if a child of 16, 17, 18 has to go through that 7 days, well, one can only imagine what their minds must be like.
What defence do you have against this kind of
None.
thing? Just to be careful?
Against that detention?
Yes.
None.
None.
Absolutely none.
Just don't get picked up to begin with.
Well, you can't avoid that unless you sleep out of your home. And if you sleep out of your home, you've something to hide. So you might as well not bother. There is no defence against it, and you have absolutely no rights whatsoever under it. Under the Act, you have no rights.
So a lawyer doesn't help?
No. A lawyer, a doctor, a priest, solicitor, visitors, no one sees you but your interrogators.
And could this happen to anyone, or?
Anyone. North or south of the border.
South also?
South also, yes. Very much so.
Mary, you wanted to talk about a statement that Carter made when he was a candidate?
Yes, that was before he became president. His remarks before the Irish National Caucus in Pittsburgh on October 27th, in which he said, "The world knows that it is a mistake for our country's government to stand quiet on the struggle of the Irish for peace, for the respect of human rights and for unifying Ireland." Now, we hold great faith in President Carter. We're waiting and hoping that he does move in this area. He has spoken out in human rights in the Soviet Union, in Chile, etc. But I just heard yesterday that he did speak out in Massachusetts 2 weeks ago. He mentioned the deprivation of human rights in Northeast Ireland. So we hope our hope is high. And on that subject, congressional hearings are being called for by the Irish American community.
Toward what end, Mary? What do you expect to accomplish?
On the deprivation of human rights in Ireland, in Northeast Ireland. And these are being backed up by many congressmen and women. And they're still coming in. They're still adding their names to it. So hopefully we'll have these open hearings because there's a dire need for them. We feel convinced that when the American people have all the evidence laid out there in front of them, and all the reports come in, that they will give us much more support in our struggle towards unifying Ireland, getting the British out, and that the suffering of our people will come to an end very shortly.
Patricia, I've heard an awful lot about what daily life in Belfast is like. And
Well, it's hard really to describe it, but it's much the same as life here. I mean, there is obviously the danger that with bombs, with the British Army, with the loyalist sectarian assassinations, I mean, that has become a very real fact of life, but it doesn't deter the people living life. They live it as normally as they can, considering the circumstances in which they live it. And I think they live a full life. But we would like to see peace.
we've heard about, you know, tremendous poverty. We've heard about crime. We've heard about alcoholism. We've heard about wife beating, that kind of thing.
Poverty is not a problem. People obviously can always do with more. You know, they can always do with more money, more luxuries, things like that. But outright poverty, people starving to death, is not a real fact of life in Ireland. South, I have heard of some cases, but they're so minute, they're not even worth considering. Crime, real crime, outside of the political arena, was virtually non-existent when one relates it to other countries in the world which do have a very high incidence of crime. Things like rape, murder for gain or murder for passion, that type of thing, was very, very little of that type of crime. Drug pushing, drug taking, virtually non-existent. Ireland as a whole has been relatively free of that type of crime. Unfortunately, with each reason to try and get rid of the British, there is a certain element of violence, but it is not from a purely self-centred, selfish point of view, which most of the violence is throughout the world. And we have not been suffering a great deal of that type of violence.
So we are getting a somewhat distorted view. Patricia, we're out of time. And Mary, thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you for watching, and good night.
This program was produced by WNED-TV, which is solely responsible for its content. Major funding was provided by public television stations. Additional support was provided by unrestricted general program grants from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and the Ford Foundation.